so this is going to be a brief session on abstracts and posters. It's pretty much the same sort of thing that I would say at a college level as well. So there will be some elements of that you should remember when you get to college. Okay, I'm going to start with abstracts. So there's 4 elements of the abstracts. So you want to make sure that the purpose of your project, whether it's engineering or science, is really well articulated, clearly and concisely. You want to then talk about your methods and your data collection, your processing of the data, and your analysis of the data. And this is all really brief, right? So your results you need to give that a little bit more room than the other elements of it. And the most weight that you want to give is to your principal conclusions. This whole thing is only 250 words, so it's really short. You don't need to put a project title on the abstract, so that doesn't count for your word count because you're not putting it in there. And really think about the hourglass that you were taught in English, just introduction, body, and conclusion, where you say what you're going to say, you say it, and then you say what you say. So that's basically the format of the abstract. Tips to remember: be concise and exact. Don't use jargon, for example. If you are going to need to use a technical term, define the term. So you don't have to give a citation for that, but people that are doing research in your area or engineering design in the area that you're working in are going to recognize how you define things as fitting within a particular body of literature. So be intentional about how you define that term, because that's, in a way, that's situating yourself. It's taking a stance. Let's see, no abbreviations or graphs go into that abstract. It's just words. And use active, not passive voice. And this is really important for all of your writing, actually. So what do we mean by that? So the subject performs the action stated by the verb. This is a very common writing error that I see all the way up through doctoral level. You are a much more persuasive, professional sounding writer if you make sure that you use an active voice. So the bacteria infected the plant. So bacteria being the subject, verb is infected, versus passive, the plant was infected by the bacteria. Typically the term was is kind of a highlighter for you, so you can tell, like, oh, that's passive voice. You want to really show that action with your words. So online, on the Crest Jane Goodall Science Symposium website, go to that website, and then on the right-hand side, you'll see there's the different levels. So click on high school and scroll down at the bottom of that page. There are examples of well-written and poorly written abstracts. So that's useful to look at because it does give you a criteria of analysis to consider. And it's going to be things like, you don't want to start a sentence with the word "and" in formal writing. If you use the word "except," make sure that it's, "except" versus "accept," that you're using the right form of the word. It's going to be tips like that you'll find. Okay, so you won't put your abstract on your poster. Instead, that's going to be uploaded to the A4 website. So the same NWSE website that you went on to do your official registration, you go into your student area of that, so you have to remember your password. And if you forget, Danielle has them all written down. So just let her know via email, and she'll send it to you. So you can get into that site, upload your abstract. And it's due by February 25th. When you upload your abstract to the site, it's going to take out things like quotation marks and hyphens. I don't know why, but it just does. So know that once it's uploaded, you can go in and edit it by inserting that punctuation back in. And you'll definitely want to do that because this is your first step. This is your first step forward, basically, with the judges. Before the judges come to look at the posters, the first thing they'll do is they'll read the abstracts of the posters they're assigned to look at. So if you've made simple grammatical errors and punctuation errors, that is not a good first step. You really want to impress them like right out the gate with a well-written, carefully edited abstract. So consider that. Okay, the poster. So the poster provides an overview of your project. So you'll sometimes see these enormous posters, for example, like that. I mean, that looks awesome, but nobody's going to have time to read all that and all the other posters. And it's really trying to act more like a teleprompter, like a script, than something that's backing you up. And that's the purpose of the poster, is to back you up, to provide things like graphical representations of data that's very concisely communicated, so that the person who's visiting your poster is paying attention to you and not sitting there like not hearing anything you're saying, trying to decode your poster. So you want to make sure that you do things like, instead of full paragraphs, you use bullet points, for example, with very few words, to really quickly communicate the most important point that you're trying to make. And you want to emphasize the scope of your project. What's inside of what you looked at? What's outside of the scope? And so really highlighting that research question or engineering goal very clearly is going to help to define that. But you don't have to write a whole bunch about that scope. You draw their attention to the research question or engineering goal, and then you say it. So communicating the nature of the research, putting really clearly, is this an engineering project? Is this a science project? What type of science project? That's something that you can also think about doing with your title. So you don't have to keep the title that you initially used. Now, once you get to the point where you have looked at your results and done your analysis, really a title that has to do with something that's new about what you did and what you found, something snappy and eye-catching, that should be your title. So that will help to communicate something about the nature of your work too. Oops. Okay. Oh, I went backwards. Sorry. Okay, so all of this is on that website that I mentioned too. So I'm not going to belabor this too much, but the things that need to be on your posters, you need a title. I do see posters that use a huge amount of space for the title, and I wouldn't recommend that. They'll have already read your abstract. They know your title. Use a reasonable amount of space. Let's see, and there are some examples of posters. There's links to examples of posters on the same CREST website that I said, so check that out and think about, like, oh, what looks good, what looks bad. Okay, problem statement, and that's true for an engineering goal as well too. You want to say, like, what is the problem in the world that this is seeking to address? And that also helps people understand what's within the scope of your work and what's not. Obviously research questions. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, other than just say that the results and analysis and the interpretation need to be given more space on your poster than, say, like, your materials that you used. You certainly want to list your materials, but you don't need to use a ton of space on your poster for that. If they want to replicate your study in some way, looking at your poster is not the way that they're going to figure out how to do that. So don't try to make that happen. So, I mean, certainly you want to put that on there, but you want to give more weight, like I said, which means more space and more time in your verbal presentation to what you did, how you did it, what your results were, and your interpretation, and most importantly, how that informs your research question or goal. You would be surprised at how many high school and even college people just forget to go beyond the results. They just report the results and they're like, there it is, I'm done. And it's like, so not done. You have to literally say, this is how my findings inform my research goal, my research question, or engineering goal. Yeah, be really explicit about that on the poster and in your verbal presentation. And that should be also part of what you talk about with the limitations. Now, a lot of kids are really tempted to say, well, I didn't do as many runs as I'd like to do, or I didn't have as many participants in my behavioral study as I wish I had. Well, that's kind of obvious, right? You can say that, but that shouldn't be the only limitation that you mention, and maybe not even the first one. Think about limitations that are very specific to your work, because that raises your credibility incredibly by acknowledging the limitations that may be going on in the back of their head, and they're not listening as carefully as they could be to what you're saying that you did do, what you did find, because they're thinking about all these limitations. Just go ahead and lay them out on the table, and don't be worried about that, because that's what we do in science. So, okay, references. You only need 5 references. You need at least 5 references, but you probably read more than just 5 articles or viewed more than 5 videos and articles altogether. Pick the ones that, these are the 2 main criteria. Pick the ones that were the most impactful on you. And think about the ones that are most relevant to your work that you actually did, and think about that by the ones that you choose that you put on there, you are situating yourself. You're taking a stance within the literature. You're communicating on an international basis when you do this work in an ongoing dialogue. So the references that you choose are actually saying, like, I'm aligning myself with them, or I'm refuting what they found. And anybody who's doing work in your field is gonna think like that. So it's good to know that that's what's going on there. So those seem like they may not be that important, but they're totally important. And properly formatting them using APA standards is really important because it raises your credibility, that you know that that's supposed to be like that. The Purdue OWL website is my favorite website for citations. Figuring out how to format things that are like government reports and things like that is a little more tricky than a journal article or a book. That's where I go to remind myself this is how you do it. Don't use a citation generator. I don't recommend that because citation generators routinely mess up. In fact, I've literally made hundreds of dollars from doctoral students who used a citation generator too close to their deadline and then paid me in an emergency situation to fix their bibliography. It's a totally boring, tedious thing to do. Don't create that problem for yourself. Just look and see how it's done and do it yourself. So later, when you get to larger pieces of research, I would suggest using something like EndNotes or one of those bibliography software pieces that will really help track it for you and help you format it properly. But at this point, we're looking at five references that you'll put on your poster. Any other ones that you think are important, those can go in your lab book, and do it. Put it in your lab book, because people might be like, oh, well, what about this? And you can be like, oh, hey, bring your lab book with you, because that's a handy thing for people to be able to ask questions that go beyond what's in your poster. Okay. The poster, well, the rule of thumb is less than 800 words. Hardly anybody does that. But if you have that in mind, that helps you kind of hit like a target. Like, okay, if it's only 800 words, that means that I should be thinking about things like graphical representations of some sort. Because if you think about it, our brains as humans developed looking at pictures to communicate. Over the last maybe couple hundred years, more and more of us have gotten access to literacy. But prior to even about 100 years ago, the majority of the human population was not taught to read or write. Only the wealthy and people who were in certain trades and the clergy. So, and most women for sure didn't learn. So our brains are really wired for seeing imagery and drawing interpretations. That's why they say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. That's why. That's where that comes from. So this is also on the Science Symposium website to remind you, but the total display size can't exceed this size. So that's important to think about. If you're using a trifold, well, that's already set up for you. But if you're doing a print poster, then you do need to think about that, because you can make it bigger. You can headings. You want the headings to not be really any bigger or smaller than these levels, because when people look at your poster, and this is true of any conference, they're going to look at multiple posters, right? So they want to go really quickly to the information that they need. And so having a big enough heading to see like, oh, that's where the research question is, really helps them go quickly to it. Use the template that is available on page 37 in the ISEF handbook. It's also on the website, to figure out where things go on your poster. Don't get too creative with where things should go on your poster, because people will waste time hunting and pecking looking for your data, and you don't want them to do that. You want them to be listening to you and not trying to decode and look for where's that, So that's a really important thing. And 16-point font or bigger is good for the body of the text. Most people are going to be standing 2 or 3 feet back from the poster, and you're in between. So you need to make sure that the font is big enough for them to refer to when you're telling them to refer to it. So, let's see. Okay, so graphics. One of the things to think about is that if you have, for example, statistical data, if you do it in Excel, Excel has a function where you can look at the different graphic representation choices that you have, like pie chart, bar chart, whatever kind of chart. And I recommend actually looking at and seeing like, okay, how is that working for my data? Is the pie chart the right one? And then run it by somebody like a sibling or a parent or whoever who really doesn't know your data very well, and ask them without giving them hints like, how do you read this? Make sure that it's really quick and easy to understand what you're trying to communicate in a very clear manner. That's a good way to get that done. So color. Color is really important. About 3% of the population is colorblind, and you don't know if your judge is going to be one of those people. And so there's a couple things to think about. Blue, red, and yellow are oftentimes colors that are difficult for people who are colorblind to discern. But you can tell on this that these are tomatoes and peppers. So even if you're colorblind, there's three types of colorblindness. Even if you're this type of colorblind, you can still see that that's a tomato. You still have a sense of what that is that you're trying to portray in the image. So think about if you use some sort of like picture of something, pick something that is really recognizable by its shape. Also, thinking, think about texture. So green can be difficult for people with color blindness to see, but you've also got this key here, adding the texture right here of the grid, so that if they can't really see green very well, and they can't discern green from yellow very well, oh, it's got a different texture. And it makes it really easy to see, oh, okay, item 3 is there. So that's another thing to consider adding. And again, Excel actually can add texture really easily. So that's something I recommend. Also, contrast is really important. If you have an image, again, they're going to be standing maybe 3 feet back from your poster. So if you add a little contrast to a picture that you have that's a drawing, that helps the item of interest that you're hoping that they're going to notice pop out. And that's what you want. You want the most important thing to pop out. So they see it quickly, and then they get back to looking at you and not staring at the poster, listening to the point that you're trying to make about that image instead of trying to decode it. Also, white space isolates important elements. So for example, with this, oftentimes you'll see people will do things like they'll make the picture take over the whole frame, and then they'll insert the text over the top of that. But the problem with that is that there's a whole lot going on in one space. And it takes them a while to figure out what is the most important thing that I'm supposed to be understanding from this. So by having this smaller and then having the text bigger and popping out like this on white space, they go really quickly to what it is you're trying to say. So it might be like a powerful quote or a bullet point, but it's not going to be a full paragraph, right? It's going to be quick, concise, and have a lot of white space around it so that they can see it. Don't try to jam everything about what you learned from your project onto your poster. Just don't try to do it. Make sure that what's weighted in the white space are the most important points that you want to make on the poster, and you can say, you can give detail verbally that you want to communicate. Also hierarchy, like how things flow on the poster. When you're reporting your data results, for example, and most importantly your interpretation of those data, as they inform the question, notice I'm not saying answer the question, inform the question. That's a really important point. Think about like, what's the most important thing? All right, this guy really wanted this to pop out, so he gave it the biggest font, or she did the biggest font is the percentage of what, and then there's a picture of a guy that looks like an executive, so that it's really quick and clear, like, okay, this is the most important finding this person wanted me to see. And the hierarchy of this is that people usually in our culture read from top to bottom. So they'll be like, oh, okay, executive. This is gonna be about an executive. It focuses their mind right at the beginning. And then as they read down, okay, what about the executive? So that flow is really important. Unity. You want to really be careful to not have a whole bunch of different colors going on, for example. The general recommendation is no more than 3, and I typically find 2. 2 colors are good. Notice here that they wanted a better to pop out, so they made this blue in the middle. And then the next slide, if you're going to have an image basically that's printed like the poster board type thing, make sure that the background color is going to be the same. So don't have like wild colors going on here. Like keep it consistent. And notice that their icons here are kind of a similar type of drawing. So if you're using icons to draw out meaning, don't go to wildly different types of characters or icons. Use ones that are similar because you don't want them to be distracted by that. You really want them to get your point and get it quickly and not cause a lot of cognitive dissonance, confusion while they're doing it, while they're looking at your poster. So think about element placement too. This is a ton of icons. I wouldn't recommend using a ton of icons. Use few icons to point out, this is what's important. When you look at the board, it pops out. This is what I really want you to see, the most important thing. And then finally, flow. It relates to an earlier slide too, but for example, when you look at this image, what do you see first? What was that? Quality, yep, quality is really big. What else? You can't hear very well.
I see grapes.
Grapes, grapes, and the sun's shining through them. And one of the goals of that is that you're supposed to feel this sense of light. There's light that's descending from the top. We read from the top in this culture. And so there's light, it has a sense of health, and then they use words that help back up that sense of health. And so this image was chosen really specifically to help back up those words, and then they put this bullseye right here that help you to connect this to this. So that flow is really intentional. So if you're using graphics, like pictures of anything, think about like, oh, okay, what's the one that really pops out? Like if you use a picture of your plastic, for example, make sure that it's a picture that like is really clearly showing like from top to bottom, like this is what I want you to notice about that plastic. So, okay, any questions about all this?
How long should we be talking for to people that come around?
Yeah, I mean, so you get about 10 minutes with the people all together. And you want to leave a pretty good amount of time. So this is a little bit up to you, but what I've noticed that people do is they'll usually spend about half the time talking to them and about half of the time in conversation with them.
Okay.
So it depends on how much you have to share to balance that. Do you guys have anything else to add to that thought?
I'd say somewhere around that in the practice. I think that's one of the things we're going through the practice judging next week will help because you feel like, oh, I burned through it way too quick. That took me 3 minutes. I could have added a lot more. I'm going on and they're starting to gloss over kind of thing. But that's where it will help. And we tell like when we do the practice judging, we ask them to shoot for about 10 minutes per student. And it like during the period itself, that may vary quite a bit more because you may get like a judge that's looking for a really specific thing. They'll just ask you about your data analysis or something like that.
Right, yeah. So yeah, it'll give you a chance at that mock symposium to think about what kinds of things are they going to ask that you can anticipate will probably be asked later. So that'll help you think about that time balance. And things like, body language, stand up straight, be confident, do eye contact, those kinds of things will all be covered in the mock symposium. All right, thanks guys.